Although the first collection of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's folk tales was published in 1812, the first illustrated edition appeared in 1819, featuring a series of formal engravings by their younger brother Ludwig. Somewhat surprisingly, examples of his illustrations are rather thin on the ground. 4 years later, in 1823, the first British edition was published, illustrated by the cartoonist George Cruikshank, better known for his satirical drawings. This was a far more characterful and lively affair which capitalised on the dark humour inherent in many of the stories, and the frequently grotesque characters involved. And although these images were also engraved for reproduction, they possessed a spontaneity not generally seen at this time in book illustration. In 1853, Edward Wennert published his interpretation of the tales, and his was an altogether more representational visualisation, more in line with what other mid-Victorian children's illustrators were by now producing. Although the immensely talented and celebrated Gustave Doré actually illustrated what was titled Les Contes de Perrault, many of these were just unacknowledged rewrites of existing Grimm's tales. And Doré's drawings, which were remarkably skillfully engraved by others, memorably evoked the inherent menace of the originals. 10 years later, in 1872, an edition with drawings by Ludwig Richter was published in Germany and Britain. And although pretty much forgotten now, these drawings were particularly successful in evoking the medieval origins of the tales. As such, they successfully refer back to the Northern European Renaissance engravings of Bruegel, and although technically not as complex as Doré's images, they possess an authority and particularly human, occasionally comedic engagement. Although British arts and crafts exponent Walter Crane had created a limited number of highly accomplished colour woodblock prints to illustrate a couple of the stories as early as 1879, when he actually published his version of the collected tales in 1882, it was illustrated in black and white only, in a deliberate stylistic recreation of medieval woodcut techniques. But in 1889, Alexander Zick produced another collection, which was printed using the complicated and expensive chromolithographic colour printing method. And additionally, thanks to the invention of the photo engraving process by illustrator Daniel Vierge a few years earlier, his line drawings didn't need to undergo the engraving process. These technological advances, combined with Zick's undoubted prowess as an accomplished narrative illustrator, made this collection a particularly engrossing and historically significant series, which was predictive of much of what followed in the coming century. 5 years later, in 1894, British illustrator Gordon Brown also took creative advantage of photolithographic printing with a series of finely rendered pen and ink drawings. They were monochrome only, but they were nevertheless possessed of a dynamic and expressive sketchy line quality which benefited greatly from bypassing the engraving process. Only a few years later, full-colour offset lithography was invented, and although it was prohibitively expensive, an increasing number of illustrated books were published featuring colour illustration produced this way. Among them was the now obscure Noel Pocock's 1900 edition of the tales, which featured representational figure work created in watercolour washes, and the new technology enabled them to be faithfully reproduced directly from his painted original artwork. But for a while at least, monochrome continued to be more commonly used, if only because it was far cheaper. And quite a few illustrators such as Robert Anning Bell, who had made their reputation with monochrome, seemed quite happy to continue as before. The remarkably expressive and attractive series published in 1904 by H.L. Schindler, about whom I can find no information, but who I'm pretty sure was German, clearly showed that in the right hands pure black and white still had its appeal. The series of detailed cross-hatched images he created was a memorable graphic evocation of the medieval Gothic origins of many of these tales, and despite Schindler's current obscurity, this edition stands out as one of the most atmospheric. In 1904, another edition, this time by Helen Stratton, was published in Britain. The book featured some accomplished line-only full-page illustrations, and others which were printed in colour. In this case, I can't tell for sure whether they were hand-coloured with washes or had the various colours added at print. But whichever it was, this was one of the earliest examples to use this approach, similar to what was being produced in comic strips of the time. Heinrich Vogler published an edition in 1907 using a very precise pen technique, and in his case the colour was definitely applied as washes. And his illustrations also incorporated highly decorative borders using other elements and characters from the given narrative. Among the most significant and enduring visual interpretations of the Grimm's tales was created by the master of folk fantasy illustration Arthur Rackham. First published in 1909, it was another which resonated with the inherent Gothic menace of quite a few of the Grimm's tales. Rackham, more than any of his contemporaries, was exploiting the potential of full colour and created images which relied on tonal washes applied over pen line work of remarkable complexity and expressive definition. All the images he produced for this volume were appropriately dark, shadowy and sinister, using a deliberately earthy palette and highly accomplished tonal renders. Unlike many other books for children published in this time frame, his colour illustrations were also accompanied by a large number of line-only images throughout the book. Unsurprisingly, this iconic edition of the tales is deservedly still in print more than a century later. Unfortunately for Leonard Leslie Brooke, his watercolour and line-drawn edition was published in the same year, and despite the fact that it was also a highly attractive, witty and imaginative visualisation, it was rather overwhelmed by the dominance of the Rackham version, and has remained in its shadow ever since. This was the real heyday of children's book illustration in Britain, and because no royalties were paid to the Grimms, many others published their interpretations for an eager public. Among them was Millicent Sowerby, whose own 1909 version also used what was undoubtedly the most popular technique of pen line with watercolour washes. Her images were quite formally composed using brighter washes of colour, and they deliberately played down the more menacing aspects of the tales. Charles Folkard's line and watercolour edition of 1911 was another which followed the lead established by Rackham in both style and choice of medium. But his version was considerably more intensely coloured, and although playfully grotesque, much less menacing. As with a worrying number of the books featured, various dates are given for its publication, but I'm going with 1912 for the version illustrated by Mabel Lucy Atwell, the British children's illustrator whose reputation was based entirely on her facility for cute characters. And despite the undoubtedly agreeable nature of her line and watercolour illustrations, hers was arguably the least representative of the actual tales illustrated to date. By this point, the view that contemporary children should not be presented with challenging imagery was pretty much universal. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 didn't completely stop publication of picture books, but understandably there weren't many being published during the conflict. Among the few significant Grimm's volumes published was another somewhat sanitised edition by American Ethel Franklin Betts in 1917, which nevertheless featured a series of charming illustrations which were painted with gouache and, unusually for the period, dispensed with the expected black line. And in the same year, another American edition by British-born illustrator Louis Reed was published, which contained spectacularly well-rendered and evocative pen and ink monochromes. In 1918, Johnny Gruelle, who would later go on to become famous as the creator of Raggedy Ann, produced an equally attractive series of illustrations using pen and bright tonal watercolour, which enjoyed success in the USA. And stylistically, Gruelle's images anticipated what might be termed the Disneyfication of these and other tales from the folk tradition. Harry G. Thieker published his series of watercolours in 1920, and although they were an attractive collection of essentially vignetted character studies, they lacked the scenic atmospheric qualities of other versions. In the same year, American Eleanor Abbott also produced some enchanting watercolours, which may have been disproportionately romantic in tone, but were nevertheless visually absorbing and pleasing to the eye. Only a year later, Jenny Harbour created a version which was a fairly radical stylistic departure, which nevertheless enjoyed popular success. Her monochrome work for this edition invoked the spirit of Aubrey Beardsley in composition and execution, and her colour work, although lacking descriptive background elements, was also unconventionally coloured and darkly romantic. And it's with this distinctively modernist version, a century after the first illustrated edition, that we come to the end of this first of two parts. So I hope I see you again when the second is uploaded.